Thank you all for joining me in this roundtable discussion of the global manufacturing outlook. I'll begin with a brief outline of the United States situation. So, U.S. GDP fell at a 2.9% annual rate in the first quarter. However, I think that was primarily a statistical anomaly. The manufacturing sector, however, grew at a 1.4% or 1.5% annual rate in the first quarter when the economy fell. And it really surged in the second quarter, growing at about a 7% annual rate. What's driven this growth is, I think, job growth overall. Basically, job growth or new people with new incomes. So consumer-related manufacturing production is growing at a moderate rate. There's still pent-up demand in some areas, and particularly the buildup of the housing supply chain is propelling the consumer-driven manufacturing sector. So I think that industrial production and consumer-driven manufacturing will grow 3% this year and 3% next year. We look for 4.5% growth in investment-driven manufacturing production this year and 6.5% growth in 2015. As a result of the growth in the consumer and investment-driven manufacturing, material-driven manufacturing will accelerate from a relatively low level. We're looking for only about 1.5% growth this year, rising to 3.5% growth next year. Overall, this means if you combine all the sectors into the total, the manufacturing production will grow 3.2% in 2014 and 4% in 2015. It's important to note, however, that manufacturing is still in the recovery phase of the cycle. Production will not achieve its pre-recession peak until the fourth quarter of this year.
Right now, in the Eurozone, manufacturing production is growing only at about 1.5%, and it would accelerate to about 1.7, 1.9 by the end of the year, and speed up to at most 2.5% next year. The outlook for Central Europe, the core Central Europe, which is made up of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, is much, much better. Growth is already close to about 5.5%, and it will stay that way through the end of the year and continue roughly, maybe even higher, closer to 6% in 2015. In Europe, particularly in the Eurozone, it's really the investment demand that drives capital goods output. And it's even not so much from within Europe, but from outside. So exports of investment goods are driving manufacturing production. The consumer is largely absent, and that's because the income growth has been very, very slow. In terms of the geographical distribution, that's also quite a bit of a contrast to the United States because it's very, very uneven. Among the big economies, you've got countries such as Germany, such as the UK, and now Poland, which are growing quite fast, between 3, 4, sometimes 5%. Spain actually is a nice surprise. It's been growing faster, although from a low base. But Italy and France exhibit still kind of slow growth. They're basically treading water. Smaller economies that used to be in the forefront of economic growth in Europe, such as Finland, Denmark, Sweden, even the Netherlands, they are barely growing. The manufacturing sectors have just emerged from recession. So all in all, we are looking at a situation where policymaking that could alleviate that is largely ineffective. It's very difficult to design either fiscal or monetary policies that would fit everyone and that would bring faster growth to Europe.
What's the forecast for manufacturing production in the Eurozone?
For the Eurozone, this year at most about 1.8, 1.9%, and for the core Central Europe about 5%. For next year, Eurozone should grow at about 2.5% rate, and core Central Europe just a little bit higher than this year, which would be about 5.5, maybe 6%.
China's economic growth moderated from 7.7% in 2013 to about 7.4% in the first quarter of this year. The deceleration was really broad, including slowdown both in both internal and external demand. The good news is recent data suggests China's economic growth is stabilizing. In June, both industrial production and fixed asset investment growth showed marginal improvement. Exports growth picked up significantly as well. In the second quarter, China's GDP grew 7.5%, which is higher than market expectation. But large-scale intervention is not very likely before China's labor market shows any signs of stress. So far, China's labor market has held up pretty well. Senior officials have repeatedly emphasized that slower economic growth rate will be tolerated to make space for structural reform. I expect China's economic growth, GDP growth, to be a little bit above 7% in both 2014 and 2015. Value-added industrial production is forecast to grow 8.7% this year and 8.5% in 2015.
Curious to hear your thoughts on how China's slowdown is affecting and will affect commodity prices.
On the agriculture commodity side, China's import demand is still very strong. But on the commodity used in manufacturing production, there's a little bit deceleration this year, mainly for many reasons. I think the economic deceleration does play some role there. But the growth, import growth, is still decent compared to the performance in the export side.
Well, I would suggest that cautious optimism is starting to enter the Indian outlook for three reasons. Number one, the new Prime Minister's Hindu Nationalist Party took 282 out of 543 parliamentary seats. That allowed him to form a government without having to broker a coalition, and politically that puts the wind behind his back for economic reforms. Secondly, he's a shrewd political operative. He's seen how fickle investment markets and the Indian public can be, and he knows that if he doesn't produce results, they can just as easily turn on him. Finally, we've seen better data on the Indian economy. For the second half of 2013 and the first quarter of 2014, export growth was a strong 12.2%, partially due to a battered down currency, but it looks like export strength has continued into the second quarter, and very recently we've seen better data on industrial output. I believe that all of this is factored in to our industrial production forecast for India. We predict that for fiscal year 2014, it will be a moderate 4.2% and then a stronger 6% in fiscal year 2015. But I need to conclude by emphasizing that because so much depends on what the new power structure in India will do right now for the economy, the confidence band around these forecast numbers is larger than normal.
We just released our Latin American manufacturing report, and our index is forecast to grow 2% this year and 2.1% next year. Now, most of that growth is explained by Mexican factories. Particularly in Mexico, we see growth in the car-making industry, but I think that going forward, that growth will be broader-based. Other supplying industries will benefit. Now, Brazil is a different story. We have an economic model that is compromised. Demand incentives have been lifted, and therefore inventories across factories are piling up, therefore production going down. Particularly, we see a very weak car-making industry, which is the growth engine in Brazil. If you move to Argentina, we also have a model that has run out of steam. Although the government became a little more pragmatic lately, there are risks all over the place. Particularly the ongoing litigation with the holdouts, which are the bond holders that did not accept the debt restructuring in 2005-2010. Argentina will have to pay. What is being negotiated is the payment terms. If you look at what sectors will drive growth in Latin America this year and next, you have motor vehicles, particularly because of Mexico, basic metals, computing equipment and electronic equipment, and other transport equipment.
What's interesting is the supply disruptions in countries like Libya, Nigeria, Angola, coupled with the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, have removed about 3 million barrels of oil per day from the world market. Now, the amount of surplus capacity, most of which is in Saudi Arabia, is relatively low. And typically, we would expect that these conditions would lead to a pretty dramatic increase in the price of oil. Fortunately, U.S. oil production has increased by 3.2 million barrels of oil per day since the beginning of 2008. That's a 64% increase from where we were. And so we've really offset these supply disruptions, and had this not occurred in the U.S., had we not seen the increase in production, the world price of oil would be sharply higher than its current level. Interesting that since 2011, the world price of oil has been relatively stable, especially when you compare the volatility of oil in the previous 10 years. But this, going forward, the stability may not persist. In fact, Yogi Berra once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And we're at that proverbial fork, because if the planned increases in production in Iraq don't occur because of the fighting over there, if we don't see more oil coming on to the world market from countries in the Middle East, the price of oil could rise sharply higher. On the other hand, if these disruptions, unplanned disruptions end, and we're seeing some evidence that that's happening in Libya, if we see more oil coming onto the market, the world price of oil could actually, over the next few years, fall sharply. So we could really either go up or down, and we're really, as I say, we're standing at that proverbial fork in the road.
Cliff, how does all this discussion frame a global outlook in your mind?
We are in a slow growth world. Every major region, every major country is struggling to one extent or another to get up to what history tells us is full strength. And really, in this world, the difference between weaker performance and stronger performance is going to be policy. Therefore, I think it's incumbent upon manufacturers to follow what governments are doing and what central banks are doing more closely than they have in quite some time, because it matters more than it has in a generation.
Well, thank you very much for this discussion. For more information on the regional manufacturing outlooks from the MAPI Foundation Economist, go to the MAPI website at mapi.net and click the research button. Thank you.